Buddha times Descartes, two methods of doubt. Grab. Descartes doubted everything. The Buddha doubted everything. One found the self, the other dissolved it. The question isn't who was right. It's why the same method led to opposite places. That's what this video is about. In 1641, a Frenchman published a small book called Meditations. 21 centuries before him, a man in India sat under a tree and meditated. Both withdrew from the world. Both refused to accept anything they hadn't tested for themselves. Both stripped away every assumption until nothing was left, and then looked at what remained. One arrived at the most famous sentence in Western philosophy. The other arrived at silence. And the distance between that sentence and that silence, that distance is where you and I are going to spend the next 45 minutes. Because it turns out, when two people use the same method and reach opposite conclusions, the interesting thing isn't who got it right. The interesting thing is what each of them was looking for. And that, the question you bring into the investigation, might be the most important thing no one talks about. But before we get there, we need to start with a night in November 1619. A stove-heated room, 3 dreams, and a young man who woke up believing God had given him a mission. Acte 1. The Doubt René Descartes. Was 23 years old. He'd been wandering through Europe, partly as a gentleman volunteer attached to various armies, partly because he didn't know what else to do with himself. He'd been educated for 8 years at one of the finest Jesuit colleges in France, La Flèche, and came out the other side convinced that almost everything he'd been taught was uncertain. Mathematics was the only exception. Everything else, philosophy, theology, natural science, rested on foundations that crumbled the moment you pressed them. So, he traveled. He watched. He waited for something. On the night of November the 10th, 1619, near the town of Neuburg an der Donau, he was alone in a small room heated by a stove, a pole, as he called it. Not a fireplace, a closed ceramic stove, the kind you find in German houses. The room was warm. The world outside was cold, and that night, he had 3 dreams. Acte 1. The Doubt René Descartes, the 3 dreams. The first dream, he's staggering through the streets. A violent wind, a whirlwind, keeps pushing him off balance. Phantoms surround him. He can't stand upright. He tries to reach a church, and the wind throws him sideways. He wakes up terrified. He lies in bed and prays for 2 hours. The second dream, a sharp crack, like a gunshot, like thunder inside the room. He opens his eyes. The room is full of sparkling lights, scattered across the walls, the ceiling, as if the air itself had ignited. Modern neurologists have a name for this: exploding head syndrome, a phenomenon at the border between sleep and waking. Descartes had no such name. He lay still and waited for his heart to slow. The third dream, he's standing at a table. 2 books appear, a dictionary and a collection of poetry. He opens the poetry at random. His finger falls on a line. Quod vitae sectabor iter? What path in life shall I take? And then something extraordinary happens. He begins to interpret the dream while still inside the dream. He knows he's dreaming, and he reads the dream as a message. When he wakes, he's certain God has given him a commission to unify all of human knowledge through the power of reason alone. He vowed a pilgrimage to the shrine of the Virgin at Loreto. Now, I want you to hold this image, A young man in a warm room, alone, having visions, asking the deepest question he knows how to ask: what path shall I take? Because 21 centuries earlier, another young man sat alone under a different kind of shelter, asked a different version of the same question, and the answer he found would contradict everything Descartes was about to build. But we're not there yet. Acte 1. The Doubt René Descartes, the Hidden Philosopher. 22 years passed between those dreams and the book that changed Western philosophy. In those years, Descartes became one of the strangest figures in European intellectual life. He moved to the Netherlands and stayed for 20 years. In that time, he lived at 24 different addresses in 13 different cities. His motto, Bene vixit, bene qui latuit. He lives well who is well hidden. He was paranoid about being found. He was terrified of the church. He'd seen what happened to Galileo. He was also, by all accounts, physically fragile, born sickly, given up for dead as a baby. As a student at La Flèche, the Jesuits let him stay in bed until noon, a privilege no other student received. He kept this habit for life. Late mornings, long hours in bed thinking, this will matter later. And there was Francine. In 1635, his daughter was born to Helena Jans, a servant. He loved this child. And in 1640, Francine died of scarlet fever. She was 5 years old. Descartes, the man who would build a philosophy on pure thought, who would argue that the mind is a separate substance from the body, wrote that her death was, in his words, the greatest regret he had ever felt in his life. And when someone suggested that a philosopher should restrain his grief, he answered, "One must not refrain from tears to prove oneself a man." Remember this, because the philosophy he published the following year, Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641, reads like the work of someone who has lost faith in everything the world has given him and is trying to find one thing, just one thing, that cannot be taken away. Acte 1. The Doubt René Descartes, the Meditations. The Meditations is not a long book. 6 meditations, meant to be read one per day, like exercises. And this is not an accident. The word meditations was deliberate. Descartes' Jesuit teachers practiced the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, a sequence of daily meditations designed not merely to inform the mind, but to transform the will. Descartes borrowed the structure. His meditations are not arguments to be read. They are experiences to be undergone. You are meant to doubt alongside him, to feel the ground disappear. And it does. Meditation 1. Descartes begins with the senses. They've deceived him before. Distant objects look small, straight sticks look bent in water. It is prudent, he writes, never to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. Fair enough, but this only gets you so far. You can stop trusting optical illusions. You can't seriously doubt that you're sitting in a room reading a book, so he pushes harder. The dream argument. I see plainly that there are never any sure signs by means of which being awake can be distinguished from being asleep. Have you ever dreamed you were awake? Of course you have. How do you know you're not dreaming right now? The dream argument doesn't just undermine one or two perceptions. It collapses the entire sensory world. Everything you see, hear, touch, all of it could be a dream. But, and this is where Descartes is remarkably precise, even in a dream, 2 + 3 = 5. Triangles have 3 sides. Mathematics survives the dream, so the dream argument isn't total, which means he needs something more radical. And here Descartes does something that still unsettles people 4 centuries later. He invents the evil demon. "I shall suppose," he writes, "that some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. Not just about distant objects, not just about whether he's awake, about everything, the sky, the earth, shapes, colors, sounds, all illusions planted by an intelligence devoted to his deception. Even mathematics, even logic, there is nothing this demon cannot fake. This is total doubt, everything gone, no world, no body, no certainty of any kind." And then, in Meditation 2, the turn. "Let him deceive me as much as he can. He will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I think that I am something." Read that again. The demon can deceive him about everything, but the act of being deceived requires someone to be deceived. The doubt itself proves the doubter. The more he doubts, the more certainly he exists. Acte 1. The Doubt René Descartes. The Correction. And here, I need to correct something that almost everyone gets wrong, and getting it right matters. The phrase most people associate with Descartes, "I think, therefore I am," cogito ergo sum, does not appear in the Meditations. It isn't there. What Descartes actually wrote is, "Ego sum, ego existo." I am, I exist. This is not a logical argument, not "I think therefore I am," as if existence were a conclusion derived from a premise. It is an immediate recognition. Every time Descartes conceives it in his mind, every time he thinks it or encounters it, it is necessarily true. Not an inference, an intuition. He exists because the act of thinking is self-verifying. I am, then, in the strict sense, only a thing that thinks, res cogitans. That is, I am a mind, or intelligence, or intellect, or reason. And to make the point sharper, he reaches for a piece of wax. Fresh from the honeycomb, it has color, scent, shape. It makes a sound when you tap it. Now hold it near a flame. The color changes. The scent vanishes. The shape collapses. The sound disappears. Every single quality your senses reported, gone. And yet, it's the same wax. You know it's the same wax, but not through your senses, through your mind. The mind is more certain than the senses, always. Acte 1. The Doubt René Descartes, the Split. And from this, from the certainty of res cogitans, the thinking thing, Descartes rebuilds existence of God, existence of the external world, and at the foundation of it all, a division that would shape the next 4 centuries of Western thought. Res cogitans, the thinking substance, the mind, and res extensa, the extended substance, the physical world. Mind and body, separated. He qualified this. He said the mind isn't in the body, merely as a sailor is in a ship. They're intermingled. But the split was made. And almost immediately, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia wrote to ask the question that has haunted philosophy ever since. If the mind is truly a different substance from the body, immaterial, without extension, then how does it interact with the body at all? How does a thought move an arm? Descartes never answered this convincingly. No one has. Gilbert Ryle would later call it the ghost in the machine. David Chalmers, in 1995, would call it the hard problem of consciousness. And both of these, the ghost and the hard problem, are direct descendants of a split that Descartes made in a small book written 1 year after his daughter died. This is one of the bravest intellectual acts in human history. To doubt everything, to destroy your own certainty, and to rebuild from what survives. Descartes earned what he found. He went further into doubt than any European thinker before him, and he came back with something. I exist. I am a thinking thing. This cannot be taken from me. But here's what Descartes never did. He proved that the doubter exists. He never asked what the doubter is. He proved that thinking is occurring. He never investigated the nature of the thinker. And 21 centuries before that stove-heated room, someone did. Act 2. The Investigation. 21 centuries before that stove-heated room, another man sat alone, not in a heated room, under a tree, not in the middle of Europe, on the plains of northern India, not after a career of wandering and study, after 6 years of the most extreme ascetic practice his culture had to offer, all of which he'd abandoned as a dead end. But the structural parallel is striking. Both men withdrew from the world. Both refused to accept inherited answers. Both sat in solitude and applied systematic investigation to the deepest question they could formulate. Both stripped away assumptions until nothing was left, and then looked at what remained. The difference is the question. Descartes sat in his stove-heated room and asked, "What can I be certain of?" The Buddha sat under his tree and asked, "What causes suffering?" And the question you bring into the investigation determines what you find. This is worth pausing on, because at first glance, these seem like completely different projects. Descartes is doing epistemology, the study of knowledge. The Buddha is doing soteriology, the study of liberation. One wants to know what's true, the other wants to know what frees. But look at what they actually did. Both doubted the senses. Both doubted conventional reality. Both went through layers of assumption, peeling each one away. Both arrived at the question of the self. Is there a self? And if so, what is it? And both used the answer to that question as the foundation for everything that followed. Same territory, same method, different questions, different maps. Act 2. The Investigation. The Wrong Question. Now, Descartes arrived at his question and declared, "Ego sum, ego existo. I am. I exist. The doubter is real. The thinker is the one certain thing." The Buddha arrived at the same territory, the question of the self, the question of the thinker. And his response was so different that it's almost disorienting. He classified the question as a wrong question. There's a sutta, the Sabbasava Sutta, the discourse on all the fermentations, MN2, where the Buddha lays out 2 ways of paying attention. One he calls yoniso manasikara, appropriate attention. The other, ayoniso manasikara, inappropriate attention. And among the examples of inappropriate attention, he lists the following questions. Am I? Am I not? What am I? What am I not? Where did this being come from? Where will it go? The Buddha says that when a person attends to these questions, which sound perfectly reasonable, which sound exactly like the questions a thoughtful person should ask, the result is not clarity. The result is what he calls a thicket of views, a tangle. And the first view that arises from this tangle is, I have a self. This occurs to him as true and established. Read that list again. Am I? That is Descartes' question, precisely. And the Buddha's position is not that the answer is no. His position is that the question itself is the problem. It generates a thicket. It produces views. And the very first view it produces, I have a self, this is true and established, is exactly what Descartes arrived at and called his foundation. Descartes walked into the thicket and called it bedrock. The Buddha saw the thicket and walked around it. So what did the Buddha ask instead? According to the same sutta, appropriate attention sounds like this. This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. MN2. Not who am I, but what is this discomfort, and where does it come from? Act 2. The investigation, the not-self test. And when the Buddha investigated with that question, he arrived at the same territory Descartes did, thinking, consciousness, the sense of being a self, and saw something completely different. There's a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, the Anatalakkhana Sutta, the Discourse on the Not-Self Characteristic, SN 22.59, which is traditionally regarded as the Buddha's second teaching after his awakening. And in it, the Buddha makes an argument so clean, so surgical, that it could have been written as a direct response to the Meditations, 21 centuries before they existed. He takes the 5 aggregates, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, and applies one test to each. If form were the self, then form would not lend itself to dis-ease, and it would be possible to say of form, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. SN 22.59. If something were truly yours, truly you could control it. That's what ownership means. Can you control what you think? Sit with that for a moment, not theoretically, actually. Can you decide what thought arises next? Can you stop a thought from appearing? Can you prevent anxiety or jealousy or boredom or the sudden intrusive image that flashes across your mind at 3 in the morning? You can't. And the Buddha's conclusion from this is precise. Thinking lends itself to dis-ease. Thinking is not fully under your control. Therefore, thinking is not self. Not because thinking doesn't exist. It obviously exists. Descartes is right about that. But because calling it self gives it a status it hasn't earned. Descartes proved that thinking exists. The Buddha asked the next question. Does that mean the thinker exists as an entity? Or is the thinker a story that thinking tells about itself? Act 2. The investigation, the root of proliferation. And there's a verse in the Sutta Nipata, one of the oldest texts in the Pali Canon, that targets this with extraordinary precision. He should put an entire stop to the root of objectification classifications. I am the thinker. Imtsen 4:14. I am the thinker. That is the cogito, not the phrase, the structure, the move from the bare fact of thinking to the claim that there is a thinker who owns the thinking. And the Sutta Nipata identifies this move, this exact move, as the root of papanka, the mental proliferation that generates conflict, identity, and suffering. What Descartes carved into the foundation of Western philosophy, the Buddha identified as the root of everything that goes wrong in the mind. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is not a takedown. This is a genuine philosophical divergence, and both sides have force. Descartes' argument is powerful. Something is thinking, that something exists. To deny it is self-contradictory. The Buddha never denies that thinking occurs. He never says, you don't exist. That would be another thicket, the opposite thicket. What he says consistently across dozens of suttas is, this is not self, not there is no self. This thinking, this feeling, this consciousness, is not self. It's a strategic distinction, and it matters. Act 2. The investigation. Who is doubting? But here's the crux. The moment Descartes never had. Descartes proves that the doubter exists. The doubter is real. Fine. But he never turns the investigation on the doubter itself. He never asks, what is this thing that doubts? He arrives at, I am a thinking thing, and stops. The thinking thing becomes the foundation. The investigation ends. And here, remarkably, Descartes' own contemporary saw the problem. Pierre Gassendi, a French priest, philosopher, and one of the sharpest minds of the 17th century, was invited to write objections to the Meditations before publication. This was standard practice. And Gassendi's objection was devastating in its simplicity. You haven't proven that you are thinking. You've proven that thinking is occurring. The move from there is thinking to I am thinking, that's the step you haven't justified. Thinking is occurring. Agreed. But who says there's an I doing it? A Buddhist philosopher 2,400 years earlier would have said exactly the same thing. In fact, the Madhupindika Sutta, MN 18, maps the chain in precise detail. It begins impersonally. Dependent on the I and forms, I consciousness arises. No agent, no I, just a process. Then, at the stage of feeling, something shifts. The text says, what one feels, one perceives. What one perceives, one thinks about. Notice the grammar. An agent has appeared. One. And from this agent, through papanka, through mental proliferation, comes the full machinery. I and mine, me and not me, self and other. The agent becomes the victim of its own construction. The cogito arrives at exactly the point where the Buddhist chain of suffering begins. Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, and calls it certainty. The Buddha says, I am the thinker, arises, and calls it the first link in the chain of everything that binds you. Acti 3. The divergence. So here we are, two men, same method, radical, systematic doubt, same territory, the nature of the self, opposite conclusions. Descartes. The self is the one thing you cannot doubt. It is the foundation. The Buddha. The self is the one thing you must not build on. It is the trap. How did the same method lead to opposite places? The answer, I think, is not in the method. It's in something that comes before the method. Something so deep that neither Descartes nor most of his readers ever noticed it was there. It's the question. Acti 3. The divergence. The shape of suffering. The Buddhist monk and scholar Thanissaro Bhikkhu, one of the most precise thinkers in contemporary Theravada Buddhism, wrote an essay called The Shape of Suffering, and in it he makes an observation that unlocks this entire comparison. He points out that Western philosophy, from the Greeks onward, has operated within a root metaphor, the metaphor of seeing. Knowledge is vision. Understanding is insight. Clarity is seeing things as they are. And the fundamental question that arises from this metaphor is, can I trust what I see? How much of what appears to me is real? Indian philosophy, and Buddhism in particular, operates within a different root metaphor, the metaphor of feeding. The mind feeds on experience. Consciousness consumes its objects. Craving is hunger. And the fundamental question that arises from this metaphor is not, can I trust what I see? But what am I clinging to? What is this appetite, and where does it lead? two metaphors, two questions, two entire civilizations of thought. Descartes inherits the metaphor of seeing. So naturally, when he sits in his stove-heated room and begins to doubt, his doubt is about perception. Can I trust my senses? Can I trust my experience of the world? Is what I see real? And the evil demon, that brilliant, terrifying thought experiment, is the ultimate expression of this anxiety. What if everything I perceive is a lie? What if reality itself is a deception? Acti 3, the divergence, threat versus condition. And notice the emotional register. For Descartes, the discovery that reality might be constructed, that perception might not correspond to truth, is a crisis. It's an emergency. The evil demon is a threat. The proper response is panic, followed by the desperate search for something, anything, that the demon cannot touch. Ego sum, ego existo. I am, I exist. Thank God, something survived. Now listen to the Buddha describe what is, structurally, the same discovery. That perception is constructed, that what appears is not what is. In the Finapindupama Sutta, SN 22.95, the Buddha offers 5 similes. Form is like a lump of foam. Scoop it from the river, and it crumbles in your hand. Feeling is like a water bubble. It appears, glimmers, and vanishes. Perception is like a mirage. You see water on the road, but when you arrive, there's nothing there. Mental formations are like a banana trunk, peel layer after layer, and there is no heartwood, no core. Consciousness is like a magic trick. It appears real, but a careful observer sees through it. And then the Buddha says, seeing this, a well-instructed noble disciple grows disenchanted with form, disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with mental formations, disenchanted with consciousness. The word is nibbida, disenchantment, not despair, not terror, not Descartes' panic in the face of the evil demon. Disenchantment. The way you feel when you realize a magic trick is a trick. You don't scream, you don't collapse. You simply stop being fooled. A monk who wisely examines these things, and the text uses the phrase yoniso upaparikati, wisely examines 19 times in this one sutta, sees them as void, hollow, without essence. SN 22.95. Same discovery. Reality is constructed. Perception is not what it seems. The self you take for granted has no core. Descartes. This is terrifying. Find certainty. Rebuild. The Buddha. This is liberating. Stop clinging. Wake up. The difference is not intelligence. It's not rigor. It's not even culture, exactly. It's the question that was asked before the investigation began. What can I be certain of? Leads you to grab on to whatever survives the doubt. What causes suffering? Leads you to release whatever the doubt reveals as empty. Same compass, different destination, because they were looking for different things. Acti 3, the divergence. 3 meditators. And this brings us to something I find genuinely remarkable, something that ties the entire comparison together. Both Descartes and the Buddha were meditators. I don't mean this loosely, I mean it technically. Descartes' book is called Meditations. It is structured as a series of daily exercises in solitary investigation, and this structure is not original to Descartes. It comes from the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, written in 1548, the foundational text of Jesuit spiritual practice. Descartes spent 8 years in Jesuit education. He absorbed this form. The scholar Zeno Wendler argued that The structure and basic moves of the first 4 Cartesian meditations conform to Loyola's scheme. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt went further. Descartes' aim is to guide the reader to intellectual salvation. So here are 3 meditation traditions. 3 men sitting alone. Ignatius meditates to find God's will. His method is devotional, prayer, visualization, surrender. The intention is submission to a higher purpose. Descartes meditates to find certain knowledge. His method is intellectual, doubt, analysis, reconstruction. The intention is to establish what cannot be doubted. The Buddha meditates to find liberation from suffering. His method is investigative, observation, disidentification, release. The intention is to see through what binds. Same tool, 3 intentions, 3 outcomes. Ignatius finds God. Descartes finds the self. The Buddha finds that the self is not what it claims to be. And this is not a coincidence. The intention shapes the meditation. The question shapes the answer. Descartes meditated with thought. He used thinking as his instrument, and naturally, thinking confirmed its own existence. The Buddha meditated with awareness. He observed thinking from a vantage point that was not itself thought. And from that vantage point, thinking looked very different, not false, not non-existent. But, to use Thanasaro's framing, not what it claimed to be. Thanissaro puts it with characteristic precision. Both self and not self are strategies of attention. The cogito is not wrong. It's a tool. But it's a tool that has been mistaken for a truth. A raft that has been mistaken for the shore. You need a raft to cross a river. But if you reach the far bank and keep carrying the raft on your head, the raft becomes the burden. Acti 3, the divergence. The legacy of the split. Now, one more thing before we leave this divergence. Because Descartes is split, res cogitans and res extensa, mind and body as 2 separate substances, didn't just create a philosophical position, it created a problem. A problem that Western philosophy has spent 400 years trying to solve, and has not. In 1995, the philosopher David Chalmers gave it a name, the hard problem of consciousness. If the mind is one kind of thing, and the body is another kind of thing, how do they interact? How does the experience of seeing red arise from neurons firing? How does the taste of coffee emerge from biochemistry? We can map every neural correlate. We can track every signal. And still, the experience itself, the felt quality of being conscious, remains unexplained. Chalmers called it hard because he suspected it might be permanently beyond the reach of third-person scientific method. And this problem, this exact problem, is a direct descendant of the split Descartes made in Meditation 6. Buddhism never created this problem, not because Buddhism is smarter, but because Buddhism never made the split. In the Mahanidana Sutta, DN 15, consciousness and namarupa, name and form, roughly mind and body, are described as mutually conditioning. You can't have one without the other. They don't exist independently and then somehow interact. They co-arise. The image in the Nalakalapa Sutta, SN 12.67, is 2 sheaves of reeds leaning against each other. Remove one, the other falls. There was never a ghost. There was never a machine. There were 2 reeds that only stood because they stood together. The hard problem of consciousness is the echo of a question Descartes asked in 1641. Buddhism never hears the echo because it never asks the question. But let me say this clearly, because it matters. They're not enemies. They're not even competitors. They're two explorers who use the same compass but pointed it at different horizons. And what each of them found is genuine. Descartes was brave. His doubt was radical. What he built did change the world. The entire structure of modern science, the emphasis on clear and distinct ideas, on mathematical certainty, on the separation of observer and observed, descends from him. He just never turned the lens on the one doing the looking. Coda. In October 1649, Descartes accepted an invitation he should have refused. Queen Christina of Sweden, 22 years old, brilliant, stubborn, wanted a personal philosopher. She wanted him in Stockholm. He didn't want to go. He hated the cold. He'd spent his entire adult life avoiding the cold. He went. Christina scheduled their philosophy sessions for 5 in the morning. 5 in the morning in a Swedish winter, in an unheated library. For a man who had spent his life sleeping until noon. For a man whose greatest thoughts had come to him in warm rooms, in bed, in the space between sleeping and waking. This was a kind of violence. Within 4 months, he developed pneumonia. On February 11th, 1650, René Descartes died. He was 53 years old. The thinker followed his body to its end. The body he had spent his life trying to prove was separate from his mind. The Buddha died differently, at Kusinara, between 2 sal trees, surrounded by monks. His last words, according to the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, DN 16, Vyadhamma Sankara, Apamadena Sampadetha. All conditioned things are subject to decay. Bring about completion through heedfulness. The investigator followed awareness to its end, and his last word was not about certainty or existence or the self. It was about attention. Both sat alone. Both doubted everything they'd been given. Both refused to accept anything they hadn't tested for themselves. One built the modern world on what he found. The other said, "What you found is exactly what you need to let go of." In 1619, a young man in a stove-heated room asked, "What path in life shall I take?" and dreamed of unifying all knowledge through reason. 25 centuries before him, a young man under a tree asked, "What is the cause of suffering?" and sat in silence until the answer came. Same solitude, same courage, same refusal to accept easy answers. Different question, and the question you bring into the silence determines what the silence gives back. Descartes asked, "What can I be certain of?" and found, "I am. I exist. I am a thinking thing." The Buddha asked, "What causes suffering?" and found, "I am the thinker." SN 414. Same discovery. One called it the foundation. The other called it the problem. What question are you bringing into yours?